Hello everyone. So we have been looking at Australia's federation and Australia's joining all of its colonies together. And our last lesson we looked at the Constitution. And everything that we've looked at now has been mainly looking about the positives of the of federation. But we're going to look at some people today that didn't get the benefits of the Australian Constitution, and we're going to have a look at how it's impacted those peoples. So the peoples that we're looking at today is the Indigenous Australians. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders peoples were not given the same rights as white Australians at Federation. So the 1902 Franchise Act took away the rights of Indigenous Australians to vote in federal elections. So that means that the people that were Indigenous Australians that had been here for over 65,000 years were not given a right to vote in the Australian government. So after Federation, the government made laws to improve the living conditions for vulnerable Australians, and especially those with disabilities and elderly. But the Indigenous Australians were excluded from these laws. As human rights improved for white Australians, they virtually vanished and disappeared for Indigenous Australians. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples were segregated from white people. They were ordered to live on Christian missions where they were forbidden from speaking in their native language or practicing their spirituality. So Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples were not recognised in the Australian census, so that they did not count towards the population numbers. Children were removed from their family and placed with white families under assimilation policies, and this was later referred to as the stolen generation. So this is the generation and what we were going through during our class last week. And the segregation and for forbidding them from speaking their native languages. We made discussions on that and what that would mean for their ancestors and also for their future children, that they wouldn't have that language to pass on and they wouldn't have their culture passed on. So we compared yourselves to those because you've got lots of native languages and what would happen if you weren't allowed to speak your native language and what would happen in those instances. So as well as all of that, property laws meant that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were no longer allowed to visit their sacred sites and live on their land. So violence was used to keep Indigenous people off the land. And in some areas, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples had to request permission from the government to marry. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples were only allowed to work certain jobs in certain industries. And in some towns, they were not allowed to use public areas like swimming pools or hotels. So just imagine how that would make you feel if you were an Indigenous Australian or a Torres Strait Islander person. How would you feel? Would you feel valued? Would you feel like you belonged? No. And the government and the Federation, that's what was made, that's what they made the Indigenous Australian and Torres Strait Islander people feel like. So what I would like you to do in your HAS books is answer the following questions and put yourself in those shoes. How would your life change if you were removed from your home? How would you feel if you could not speak your native language? And what actions might you make to try and change that situation? What could you do to help change that situation? So you are writing those ones in your HAS book. And now we're going to watch a video on the 1967 referendum. So remember, a referendum is when we voted, when Australians who had the right to vote, voted to change a portion of the Constitution. So we're going to quickly watch that now.
The 1960s were a time for change, from pop culture to milestones in science
It's one small step for man.
and human rights movements.
I have a dream that my poor little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. I have a dream today.
Here in Australia, people's attitudes were also starting to change. For a long time, Indigenous people didn't have the same rights as other Australians. They faced a lot of discrimination and weren't counted as citizens of their own country. But many Indigenous and non-Indigenous Aussies realised that things could and should be different, and they started demanding equality. In 1962, all Indigenous people were given the right to enrol to vote in federal elections like everyone else. In 1965, Indigenous workers stood up against unfair working conditions and fought for land rights. And in the same year, uni students protested against racism and poor living conditions around country New South Wales.
Mrs. Bandler, how concerned are you as a New South Wales representative?
Around this time, activists had also set their sights on a really big goal that would involve the whole nation. They wanted to change sections of the country's constitution which discriminated.
And I feel that the time has come when Australia can no longer tolerate legal racial discrimination against its Indigenous people.
The Constitution is the most important legal document in the whole country. It sets out just how Australia works, so how the government's put together, how the courts work, how the states work, and what the government can and can't do. So changing it isn't easy. To change the Constitution, there has to be a referendum. That's where everyone over 18 votes yes or no to the changes. To get the government to even hold that referendum, campaigners set out to get signatures on a petition. They set up tables in the streets of all capital cities and country towns, and even waited outside footy matches and churches. Eventually, they collected 100,000 signatures, and after 10 years of campaigning, they finally got their vote. On May 27, 1967, Australians went to the polls. In the end, 90% voted yes to changing the Constitution. It was the biggest yes vote in our nation's history. The changes meant 2 lines were removed from the document, giving Indigenous people the right to be included in Australia's population figures and giving the federal government the power to make laws for Indigenous Australians. That last one later paved the way for things like the Land Rights Act, which has given many Indigenous Aussies traditional ownership of their land again. 50 years on, there are still problems that need to be solved. And for many years, people have been pushing to change Australia's constitution again because it doesn't recognise Indigenous Australians as the nation's first people. And it still lets governments make laws which discriminate based on race. But the 1967 referendum is still seen as a milestone in our country's history that brought Australians together and changed the nation for the better.
So after we have watched that now, we are going to complete the next task. And our next task is that you are going to imagine that you are an activist. So you are somebody that is fighting for the rights of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the Australian Constitution. And you are wanting to improve their social and working conditions. So you're going to create a poster in your Hasbook that convinces other Australians to vote yes in the upcoming referendum on the 27th of May, 1967. So similar to how we had posters going up around the school advertising our bake sale, you are going to advertise that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders deserve the right to be included in the nation's population count, and that they must have the same rights as all other Australians. And you're going to create a poster encouraging people to vote yes. I can't wait to see what they look like, and I would like you to send them through on Class Dojo. So if you have any questions, please let me know. That is your task for today.